Homelessness, Paper 2, Question 4. Lesson objectives. All learners will plan an answer to Paper 2, Question 4 on homelessness. Write an answer to Paper 2, Question 4 on homelessness. Please open your books or your computer record of what we're doing in the English lessons. Write the date, the 6th of March 2023, and Paper 2, Question 4, Homelessness in your books. Then copy the question below. For this question, you need to refer to the whole of source A together with the whole of source B. Compare how the writers have conveyed their different views and perspectives of the behaviour of the authorities towards the poor. In your answer, you could compare the different views and perspectives, compare the methods they use to convey those different views and perspectives, and support your ideas with quotations from both texts. 16 marks. Stop the video so that you can copy this question before we move on. This is a favela. It's in source A. A favela is a large shanty town in South America. It's built by the people who live there, and there often isn't sanitation and very good transport. Source A. This broadsheet newspaper article looks at the issues of families losing their homes as Rio de Janeiro in Brazil prepared to host the World Cup in 2014. Rio World Cup demolitions leave favela families trapped in a ghost town. From the roof of his home in the favela do Metro, Eomar Freitas enjoys one of the best views in town. Looking south and you see Christ the Redeemer statue towering over Rio's mountains. To the north stands the green and pink headquarters of Mangueira, the city's best-loved samba school. And in between, one of the world's top sporting venues, the blue and grey Maracanã Stadium, which will host the final of the 2014 Football World Cup. We worked hard to build this place, says Freitas, 35 and unemployed, whose family moved to Rio from Brazil's impoverished northeast 20 years ago. They built a 4-storey home where their wooden shack once stood. It was a great place to live, he said. Not anymore. Since February, nearly all of the buildings surrounding Freitas' home have been levelled as part of work to revamp the city's infrastructure before the World Cup and the 2016 Olympic Games. Red brick shacks have been cracked open by earth diggers. Streets are covered in a thick carpet of rubble, litter and twisted metal. By night, crack addicts squat in abandoned shacks, filling sitting rooms with empty bottles, filthy mattresses and crack pipes improvised from plastic cups. The stench of human excrement hangs in the air. It looks like you're in Iraq or Libya, Freitas said, wading across mounds of debris that now encircle his home. I don't have any neighbours left. It's a ghost town. Among them are elderly women and children, including a 4-year-old boy with microcephaly and cerebral palsy. We ask God to support us so our hearts don't give out, said 77-year-old Sebastiana de Souza, who has spent 13 years in the favela, sharing a damp, cramped apartment with her daughter and 4-year-old great-grandson, who now plays football next to a heap of broken concrete, abandoned furniture and discarded toys. Souza said she hoped to be relocated to a nearby estate. It's sad, it used to be pretty round here. The reasons for the favela demolition are disputed. Locals believe authorities plan to replace it with a car park for the nearby stadium, a story endorsed by one demolition worker. The World Cup is on its way and they want this area, said Freitas. I think it is inhumane. Rio's housing secretary, Jorge Bittar, said the demolition was part of a £285 million project to transform the region around the Maracanã, itself the centre of a £330 million pre-World Cup revamp. Cultural centres, tree-lined plazas and a cinema would be built, he said. This is a very poor community with very precarious homes built in an inappropriate area, and we are offering the families dignity, he said. Here is the text in slightly bigger form. Stop the video if you wish to read it through again. Here is the text in slightly bigger form. Stop the video if you wish to read it through again. Here is the text in slightly bigger form. Stop the video if you wish to read it through again. This is a Scottish croft from the 19th century. It's in Source B. A Scottish croft was a small farm in the Scottish Highlands. This one is actually derelict, and you can see some workers who would have been growing crops on the land. Source B. This extract comes from a report carried out into the forced removal of families from the Scottish Highlands in 1884. Mr. Ross went from Glasgow to Greenyard all the way to investigate the case upon the spot, and found that Mr. Taylor, a native of Sutherland, well educated in the evicting schemes and murderous cruelty of that county, and Sheriff Substitute of Ross-shire, marched from Tain upon the morning of the 31st of March at the head of a strong party of armed constables, with heavy bludgeons and firearms conveyed in carts and other vehicles, allowing them as much ardent drink as they chose to take before leaving, and on their march so as to qualify them for the bloody work which they had to perform. Fit for any outrage, fully equipped, and told by the sheriff to show no mercy to anyone who would oppose them, and not allow themselves to be called cowards, by allowing these mountaineers victory over them. In this excited, half-drunken state, they came in contact with the unfortunate women of Greenyard, who were determined to prevent the officers from serving the summonses of removal upon them, and keep their holding of small farms where they and their forefathers lived and died for generations. But no time was allowed for parley. The sheriff gave the order to clear the way, and, be it said to his everlasting disgrace, he struck the first blow at a woman, the mother of a large family, and large in the family way at the time, who tried to keep him back. Then a general slaughter commenced. The women made noble resistance until the bravest of them got their arms broken. Then they gave way. This did not allay the rage of the murderous brutes. They continued clubbing at the protectless creatures until every one of them was stretched on the field, weltering in their blood or with broken arms, ribs, and bruised limbs. In this woeful condition, many of them were handcuffed together, others tied with coarse ropes, huddled into carts, and carried prisoners to Tain. Compare how the writers have conveyed their different views and perspectives on the behaviour of the authorities towards the poor. In the Rio favelas, the main questions are: what do we know about the favela? Was it a good place to live? What state is it in now? Have the residents been offered other accommodation? Is a reason given for demolition by the Housing Secretary? The answers are the following. The favela is described in some detail. It was a good place to live. Now it's ruined, but there's no violence by the authorities. The residents may have been offered other accommodation. A positive reason is given for demolition by the Housing Secretary. In the text on the Scottish crofts, the main questions are: do the authorities use violence? The removals are mainly directed at whom? Did the authorities demolish the buildings or remove the people? And were they offered alternative accommodation? The authorities use violence. The removals are mainly directed at women. The authorities did not demolish the buildings but removed the people. They were not offered alternative accommodation, only prison. Remember to use the petal structure. What does the writer show, and does it differ between texts? That would be your point. Back that up with a quote, your evidence. Name the technique if you can, and don't forget structural techniques. And your analysis. Explain the writer's perspective and how the reader would think or feel after reading that text. I will look at your answers the next time I see you, so I will expect you to have a full answer completed with the correct date and title at the top of the page, followed by a plan. I have provided planning sheets for you with 3 columns, so slightly less detail than the plan that I've given you in this video. You're welcome to use those, or you can plan in your book. Identify your quotes before you start. Here is an outline plan. I've chosen 4 different statements so that in text A there's no violence, just demolition. In text B there is violence. In text A there is alternative accommodation offered. And in text B there isn't, they're just taken to prison. So that's the start of a plan, and it's up to you to fulfil that plan. There are 5 columns in this plan. Space for evidence, technique and analysis, but also if you want to pick out individual words, remember if you have shorter quotes but you say more about them, that's going to get you better marks. So once you've decided on a longer quote, maybe you can whittle that down to a very short quote, maybe 2 or 3 words, which will say just as much as a longer quotation and take you less time to write. Here is the plan with some suggestions of things that you could put in there. In the favela, there's no violence to people, just demolition. For example, there's rubble, litter and twisted metal. Some of the techniques are the rule of 3, the semantic field of demolition and an emotive adjective, twisted. The reader understands that despite the residents liking their home previously, it's now been reduced to rubble and ruined. The adjective twisted gives a perverse tone to the destruction of an established community. Whereas in text B about the Scottish crofts, there is violence, and you can see that in the nouns that are used: bludgeons, outrage, firearms, cruelty. They're very violent nouns. You could pick on fewer, for example, outrage, and this shows that the writer disapproves of the heavy-handedness of the constables and their brutality towards the crofters. The reader would feel shock at the level of violence to achieve the evictions. Don't forget to use discourse markers to make your intentions absolutely clear. For example, both, talking about both texts, or however, if you want to say something's different to something else. And additionally, whereas would also show a difference. Here are some different ways to say the writer shows. You could use the verbs demonstrates, illustrates, proves, displays, reveals, describes, highlights, defines, illuminates, clarifies, exemplifies, portrays, emphasizes, connotes, depicts, suggests, points out, explains, confirms, indicates, outlines, exhibits, establishes, presents, points to, validates, or conveys. So it's now time for you to construct a question for answer on this text. Remember that there are some very obvious differences between the actions of the authorities in both texts, so focus on your plan and try and use some interesting ways of saying the writer says, using some of the new vocabulary that I've just told you.